Okay, so this is the talk that I gave at the University of Puget Sound on January 28th, and there were requests for folks that wanted to share recording the video. And since University of Puget Sound wasn't able to record it, I have done this recording and then shared it on my own YouTube channel. So hopefully it is useful for folks. This is about measuring a project that I did to measure the impacts of military aircraft on a very large landscape, the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. Okay, so my name is Lauren Kuehne, and the work that I'm going to be presenting today is about measuring the impact of military aircraft on a large landscape out in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. I was at the University of Washington for a long time, so I'm not there anymore. I'm now an independent consultant, but I acknowledge that affiliation because all of the work that I'm going to be describing was done during my time at the UW. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Julian Olden, who is a co-author on the paper that I'm going to be discussing today. And Julian is also at the University of Washington in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. So just a little bit about me. It's nice to know who you're listening to. Scientifically, I'm sort of Puget Sound born and raised. Graduated in 2007 from the Evergreen State College. I worked for a couple of agencies, the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In 2009, I started my master's degree at the Aquatic and Fishery Sciences Department at the University of Washington, and I ended up staying on there as it's called a soft money researcher until the end of 2019. And in that position at the UW, I had the opportunity to do conservation-based research that my strong preference is to do applied work. And I had the opportunity to collaborate with a lot of different state, federal agencies, NGOs, tribes. That's the kind of work that I prefer to do. I like to do work that sort of originates from these entities that are doing applied work. And so I still continue to collaborate with folks such as the ones I've listed here. So the structure of this talk, it follows four sort of components. And because sound and noise and acoustics aren't necessarily the most well-studied or frequently studied topics, I usually try and sort of enter with a warm-up, calling the sound and noise a primer. The second portion of the talk is devoted to a 3 to 4 year study that was just published last year related to measuring growler jets and their extent of their impact on the Olympic Peninsula soundscape. The third portion is shorter. It's data that I'm just starting to tinker with, but now that we've measured the extent of the growler jet noise, we want to start thinking about how those may play out in terms of thinking about impacts on wildlife. And then the last portion, because this is applied research, it's been done in a very applied context next to an environmental impact statement. And so there are some very specific and tangible policy implications and conclusions to discuss at the end. Okay, so sound and noise, a primer. Let's get started. Sound, what is sound? Well, sound is energy. It's when you clap your hands, you emanate created sound energy that emanates out. It travels as a wave. And waves have properties that we are interested in. And these are two properties in particular, the ones that we're almost always measuring when we talk about measuring sound and noise. The first of these is frequency, which is the period between the two consecutive wave heights. And then we also have amplitude, which is the height of the wave. Now, we don't go around talking about either frequency or amplitude. We always talk about, instead of frequency, we talk about pitch, the highness and lowness of sound. So birds twittering are a high sound, transportation noise, trucks, aircraft, that kind of thing are low frequency sounds. Amplitude, we never talk about amplitude, but we do talk about power, intensity, and loudness. We almost always use the term loudness. However, when we talk about measuring sound or noise, these are the two properties that we're almost always strictly interested in, or an interaction between the two. But there's another whole component to sound. So sound is not just energy, it's actually more of a transaction between two entities. So there's a source of the sound energy or the vibration. There's a medium that it goes through. It travels differently, whether it goes through air or whether it goes through water. For example, there's no sound in space because there's no air in space for it to travel through. So the medium does matter when we're thinking about sound. And then on the other end, there needs to be a receiver that can both hear and interpret that sound. And I use this table to sort of illustrate how this works. And it's especially important to consider this when we're thinking about impacts of noise on wildlife. So here, for example, people, our ears hear best between 1 and 5 kilohertz. We can certainly we certainly hear noise outside of that range, but we distinguish sounds best between those frequencies. However, bats are echolocating above 20 kilohertz, which we can't even hear. So bats may in fact be very noisy, but because we can't hear them, we wouldn't say that. Insects, however, can detect bat echolocation calls. And in fact, in some cases, they've evolved to be able to jam those signals. And when you start to look into acoustic relationships between wildlife, you start to see all kind of interactions like this that maybe are beyond the scope of our hearing and our imagination because we don't use our ears in this way. Another example that I like to give is orcas. So marine mammal eating orcas or transient orcas, well, all orcas use echolocation, but they use it for hunting and they use it for communication and to orient themselves. However, when they're hunting seals or sea lions, they'll often go into what's called stealth mode and they'll stop echolocating because otherwise the seals and sea lions can hear them. And again, when we start looking, where this is sort of important to recognize is that our ears don't operate the same way that other animals do and other wildlife do. And so sometimes when we think about noise that's disruptive to us, it may not in fact be disruptive to other wildlife. But the flip side is also true, that sounds that are not disruptive to us may be very disruptive to wildlife. So we have to get out of the scope of our own hearing and our own imagination to consider what sound and noise is occurring like from the perspective of the receiver. Okay, so we know what sound is. It's energy, it's an interaction between two entities, but then what is noise? And I just use this generic definition from Wikipedia. It's pretty good and it's a widely accepted definition of noise. It's unwanted sound judged to be unpleasant, loud, or disruptive to hearing. Now, there are a lot of subjective words in this definition. Unwanted, so who's doing the wanting? Some people like the sound of fireworks. Other people don't like the sound of fireworks. Unpleasant, loud, or disruptive. So, you know, my children and I have a very different idea about what constitutes unpleasant, loud, or disruptive. So we just need to keep in mind that when we're talking about noise, we've jumped to a sort of subjective definition for the most part. That said, even though it is a subjective concept, there are aspects of sound that we can think about when we're talking about noise, or that are obvious when we're talking about noise. The first of these is loudness, and it's a very important component of noise, and maybe one that we focus a little too much on because not everything that's loud is noisy, and vice versa. But let's talk about loudness for a minute. So loudness is measured in what's called decibels. The decibel scale is often presented in this way, where we have from 0, the softest sounds that a human can hear, all the way up to the point at which our ears are instantly and permanently damaged. And then it's very common to sort of present these landmarks so that you know where you are on this decibel scale: rustling leaves or lawnmowers or jet aircraft, that kind of thing. Now, sound and noise impact people differently. However, there is substantial research that's allowed us to establish some thresholds at which certain types of impacts on health and well-being sort of tend to kick in, and then they occur over these different ranges. And the first of these is sleep disturbance. Now, sleep disturbance can start pretty quiet sounds, 35 to 40 decibels, and of course, moving upwards into that. The next set of impacts that they sort of form like a suite of impacts, and these are all related to annoyance, breaks in concentration, distraction. These can then result in actual delays in cognition or learning, and then impacts on memory as well. And there's very famous research that actually established how children in classrooms, or sorry, children in schools that were on noisy classrooms, so the same buildings, but there was a noisy side and a quiet side, and children in the noisy side actually had reduced reading scores compared to the same classrooms in the other side of the building. And so even though we think about it as just annoyance or distraction or that kind of thing, they actually do have tangible outcomes from this suite of impacts that occur. The next layer of impacts that starts to kick in is around 50 decibels and higher. We start to see cardiovascular health impacts. So our heart rate and our blood pressure go up in response to acute and also chronic noise. And so we can start to see people can see increases in hypertension and other cardiovascular health that is associated with chronic noise. And then around 85 decibels and above, we have risk to hearing. That's where hearing protection is recommended. And so above that, depending on the duration and the loudness, we can either have temporary damage to hearing or permanent damage to hearing. Now, a really important aspect of decibels and loudness to remember is that decibels are on a logarithmic scale. So every time you add 3 decibels, you have doubled whatever acoustic energy was there before. So when someone says, well, it's only in 3 decibels more or increased, you need to know where on the scale you are. If you double the amount of acoustic energy in a library, you haven't done very much. However, if you've doubled the acoustic energy of a lawnmower, you've done quite a lot. So that is just something that you always want to be aware of when you're thinking about loudness and increasing decibel levels. The other thing that we know from substantial amounts of research is that noise, what we call noise and what we constitute as noisy, is determined somewhat by our psychological state and our relationship with the noise source. So we're far more likely to be upset and annoyed if noise is unexpected, if it's intermittent, and we lack control or feel we lack control over the source. And if you think about the types of sounds that are likely to disrupt, upset you, they're probably going to have these characteristics. So some classic things are fireworks, leaf blowers, snoring is another one. All of them, they tend to have these things in common. We lack control over them, unexpected, and they're intermittent and variable. Okay, so this is the last slide in my sound and noise primer. And it's an important one. So we'll see these spectrograms over and over throughout the talk. So I'm going to spend some time breaking this down. This is one of the primary and most useful tools that we have to analyze sound is a spectrogram. And what a spectrogram is a visualization of audio data. So what you're seeing here is a spectrogram of 1 hour of sound data that I recorded out on the Olympic Peninsula. We have X on the X-axis is time. In this case, it's an hour. On the Y-axis, we have frequency. Again, the highness and the lowness of the different types of sound. So here, this audio file ranges from 0 to 22 kilohertz. The last thing you need to know about a spectrogram is that the color represents the relative loudness of the sound. In this case, the cool blues are the quietest sounds, and then moving all the way up to pinks and even some white, which indicates the very loudest sounds in this audio file. Now, there's a lot of variation in this, but we can make some generalizations about what types of sounds occur at what types of frequencies. Human-generated noise, including transportation, aircraft, trucks, traffic, that kind of thing, are almost always between 0 and 3 kilohertz. That's not all, that's not, there is human sound that goes well above that, however, but generally speaking, it's going to be in this low frequency zone. Frogs and birds, again, there's variation here, but it tends to range between 1 and 10 kilohertz. Insects have a very large range, 2 to 15 kilohertz, and bats produce what's called ultrasonic noise because we can't hear it, and that is above 20 kilohertz. So now that we've talked about this spectrogram, we can sort of start to break it down and interpret it a little bit. Now, this was out on the Olympic Peninsula, and these very prominent pink and even a little bit of white humps, if you will, are Growler aircraft, which are prominent out on the Olympic Peninsula. And here they're they're clearly the loudest events in this particular audio file, in this particular soundscape. The beauty of passive acoustic monitoring, though, is that it's very high resolution. And so we can actually zoom in and on individual bird calls too. So the nice thing about this is that it allows us to capture sound and noise at these large temporal and spatial scales, but we can also capture very detailed information about occupancy of different birds or anything that vocalizes really, or even changes in vocalization, sometimes habitat use. Okay, so that was the end of part 1. The next part is going to be about a 3.5-year project that I just published last year, which was measuring the extent and the impact of Growler jets on the Olympic Peninsula. Now, this study was initiated because in 2016, the US Navy completed their transition of an aircraft. They used to use a Prowler aircraft for electronic warfare. They started using what's called a Boeing EA-18G Growler, which is a more powerful aircraft. At the same time that this transition was happening, there was also a national consolidation of growler training to Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. So now any pilot that needs to learn to fly these growlers has to come to Whidbey Island, and they train out of Whidbey Island. So of course, when this is occurring, the Navy needed to increase their electronic warfare training and air-to-air combat. And so they proposed an increase for the nearest military operations area, which was the Olympic military operations over the Olympic Peninsula. However, when this was, and they started an environmental impact statement process, not only for the increase in growler training, but other activities too, that they do in the region. Now, the challenge was that in 2016, there was really no data on these noise levels. Residents and visitors had started to complain about the sound as soon as the growlers started flying, really, but it was very anecdotal. You know, folks said, oh, they're flying all the time and every, you know, days, nights, weekends, and then other people said, no, we never hear them. And so this project just initiated because it's sort of, we said, well, let's just go measure it so that we can have an empirically based conversation about not only the current noise levels, but the proposed increase. And so that's how this project got started. I mentioned there were sort of immediate, starting pretty much as soon as the growlers started flying in 2016, they started gaining media attention. And that has consistently continued over, I'd say, the last 4 to 5 years, not only in local and regional outlets, but also, you know, in the New York Times and Earther Magazine, High Country News. International outlets have paid attention to this issue. And I think that that's worth considering why that is. Now, the Olympic Peninsula is home, of course, to the Olympic National Park. It's a much beloved national park, has been there since the 1920s. And it's visited by more than 3 million people a year, not only domestic and local audiences, but also it has a very large international following, I guess. It's a World Heritage Site. So the park has been there for a long time. It's very cherished and has some of these obviously very unique and special landscapes. The peninsula is also home to multiple Native American tribes. That's their home. And they have these very deep spiritual, cultural, and economic relationships with the landscapes and also with wildlife there. And then lastly, there's multiple residential communities that have been in place for a long time there. So both formally through the Olympic National Park, and then also informally, this region has been set aside as a place of wilderness, refuge, of recreation, of, you know, a place that people can go and escape. So I think that is why it has sort of gained so much attention and continues to be of great importance, this issue, not only nationally, but even internationally as well. However, given that there's a grandiose backdrop to that, but our study objectives were in fact pretty straightforward, which was just to say, okay, what are the current noise levels from different aircraft on the Olympic Peninsula soundscape? And then we can talk about that proposed increase and say, well, then how then would these noise levels be expected to change in the future with these increases in training? The last part is stuff that an objective I'm just starting to get into now, which is to think about what are the potential impacts on area wildlife. Okay, so this map shows our study design, fairly straightforward. This map is of the Olympic Peninsula. These are our monitoring locations. In 2017 and 2018, the 3 sites in blue, these were our primary monitoring locations. We recorded sound at these 3 locations simultaneously in 4 seasons. We did it at summer, fall, winter, and spring, and that's because the seasonal soundscape can change. We recorded 10 days at a time, so at the end of that year, we ended up with 40 days total of audio recordings in each of these sites. We're using these wildlife acoustic song meters. These are very robust, weatherproof units. They have good capture a wide range of frequencies. They're very sensitive, and they're relatively affordable, so that we could put 3 of them out simultaneously. And then the last 2 sites are in orange, and we monitored these sites for 6 days sort of opportunistically in the summer. So we ended up with data from 5 locations. Now, the footprint of the Olympic National Park is shown on the map in brown. I also include the critical habitat for the two ESA listed terrestrial species, marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl. And then the last item on the map to show you is the red hatching shows the footprint of the Olympic military operations area, which is where the military training occurs. Now our sites, you know, they were well forested. They were a sufficient distance, about almost a mile at least, a minimum from any major highway noise. There's not a lot of vehicle traffic out there, but on near highways there is. So we put the song meters out there at these different sites for the period of time. And what we ended up with at the end of the year is over 3,000 hours of audio recordings that needed to be processed and analyzed. So the way that we did that, here's our trusty spectrogram again. And in this case now, we have time again on the x-axis, but frequency I've zoomed in so that you're only looking at the low frequencies now. And so those aircraft events show up very well and very easily. And of course we can listen to this and, you know, zoom in further. And the way that we did that then is that the aircraft events, by listening to them, you can identify the start and the end time. And we simply identified and annotated every single aircraft event. We were hoping originally to be able to automate this process, but that did not end up being the case. So we just had to do it the old-fashioned way. And I think it took me and a team of volunteers, including 2 interns that did a lot of work on this, about 9 months to go through it all. And then we have to go through it again to validate everything. So we did that we repeated that process 3,000 times or more. And what we end up with is a data set of these 3 primary metrics. And then most of the results that I'm going to start showing you in the next slide are developed from these 3 metrics. We have the number of aircraft events and the classification. We have the duration in seconds of each of these so that we can summarize that duration or use them individually. And then of course we know the exact time of the day in which each of these events occurred. And I didn't mention the classifications were commercial aircraft, military aircraft, for the most part, those are Growlers, and then recreational or prop planes. Helicopters were very rare. We had a few, but they were very rare. Okay, so I'm going to start showing now the results from that data processing. The first question that we wanted to answer was just, well, what is an event? What does an aircraft event, you know, look like, and how long does it last? So again, we processed over 3,000 hours of audio, and from those 5 locations, we analyzed more than 5,000 different flight events. Now this graph here shows the mean duration of the different types of aircraft event. So the box plot shows the mean duration and then also the variation around that duration. And for a commercial, which is in black, helicopter, very rare, but we did include it. Military, again, these are mostly Growlers, and prop planes. And what was interesting is that although the mean duration was very similar, about 2 to 2.5 minutes, obviously the military aircraft, you can see there's a huge variation around what we could consider an event, which was continuous noise data from that event. It ranged from everything from 5 seconds all the way up to 24 minutes. And the reason I show this result first is that it tends to sort of permeate through every other result. So for example, when someone says to me, how loud is a Growler event? I have to say, well, do you mean the 10-second event or do you mean the 24-minute event? And this can make it challenging to characterize the noise data when it's so variable. The other thing that I bring up here is that when we want to compare this type of military aircraft training and this type of noise impact, and we want to compare it to, say, commercial aircraft, which we're much more familiar with, this graph is sort of intended to show why that comparison is both very challenging and potentially very inappropriate. Okay, so the next result that we were very interested in is to say, well, when are they flying? And is there a pattern to when you're going to hear the aircraft noise? So this graph here, what we did is we took every single second of aircraft data, we put it in a pile, and then we separated it out by category, and then plotted it by the hour of the day. This is over our 40 days of sampling data. So on the x-axis, you have hour of the day, and then the y-axis is total duration. So what you're looking at is the proportional contribution of these different types of aircraft. So commercial, helicopter, military, and prop planes. And you know what stands out, of course, is that the lion's share is the dark gray or the military aircraft. And when we do the math on, actually calculate the percentages out, it turns out that 88% of our aircraft noise was military, again, mostly Growlers, 5% commercial, and then prop and helicopters combined were 7%. The other thing that really jumps out is that there's a clear daily pattern to this. The Growler training starts around 9 for the most part, sometimes a little bit earlier than that. But we don't really hear military aircraft much until about 9 a.m. Then there's a strong peak in activity until about 5 p.m., at which point it tapers off. 75% we found was between 9 and 5 p.m. Still a healthy chunk, about 20% was going on between 5 and 10 p.m. Now, we also found that weekly, so 92% of our military flights were recorded, or what we detected were on weekdays. This is very consistent. So Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, it's not a formal policy, but it's an informal policy, or it's not a written policy, I guess. It's an informal policy that they've followed for a long time, decades, which is to operate as needed, only as needed on weekends. So the fact that we detected 92% of our military flights on weekdays was consistent with their policy. The other thing that's consistent is the high proportion of military aircraft. So the FAA is going to reroute commercial aircraft around an active military operating airspace. And so the more that military operating airspace is activated, the lower proportion of commercial aircraft we're going to see in there. Okay, the third thing that we were interested in is to say, well, the number of events per day. So how often is a person going to hear an aircraft coming and going? And what we found is that even though there's a lot of variation, this graph here shows the distribution of the number of flights events per day when training on training days. And what we saw is that typically sites could be expected to hear between 20 to 60 events. However, there was a lot of variation in that, and the maximum number of events could be up to 90 or even more than 100 in some locations. So there's a lot of that variation. The point of this is saying that the aircraft are coming and going quite a lot, and it makes it very intermittent and variable. Okay, and then this is the last slide of the results talk. I'm going to talk about loudness in the second part of it, but for this, what we were interested in is saying, okay, well, if you're out on the Olympic Peninsula and you're going for a hike and you're there at noon or the middle of the day, how much of that hour are you likely to hear aircraft noise? So we took the same information, but we calculated the percent time audible by the hour of the day. So again, on this graph, we have hour of the day on the x-axis, and now on the y, we have percent of that hour in which military aircraft were audible. Now on this site, I do also have it broken out by our 3 primary locations. And you don't have to get too bogged down in what the individual bars are doing, but the take home is that those 3 locations are more or less moving in tandem. And so the noise is, in a noisy hour, most of these sites were being impacted in kind of similar proportions. And what we found is that on weekdays, on training days, percent time audible was 10 to 20% of these daytime hours. You pencil that out and do the math, you end up with about 60 to 90 minutes of aircraft noise per location per training day. And again, this is coming and going. The metric that we have sort of come up with is that a hiker on a 6-hour hike is probably going to hear about an hour of aircraft noise during that time coming and going. And again, we found that the aircraft noise was really correlated in sites that were very distant. So the impacts are felt over very large portions of the military operations area, and they're not localized. Okay, so this is the last slide in the second section, and I'm going to talk about loudness in the third section. But for now, the key take-home, the key points of this research was that we found that military aircraft currently are constituting the majority of human noise out on the Olympic Peninsula. And what that means is that the Navy's decisions are going to be really what dictates most of the future soundscape in this area. The noise is really variable. It is concentrated during daytime hours. However, the variation is very high, and I've personally experienced, over 3 hours of noise in a single day. And again, it can be up to 100 individual events. The geographic impact is not localized. It's widespread across large components of the military operations area. And the aircraft noise can be surprisingly loud. Our equipment was able to measure up to 82 decibels. The Navy's own noise analysis says that, depending on elevation, the noise levels can reach up to 100 decibels. So it can be surprisingly loud. However, our data suggests that probably the more important impact is going to come from this chronic noise. It's pretty much every weekday. It goes on for, typically you'd hear an hour to an hour and a half a day. It's coming and going. So it's got a lot of those characteristics that are considered most sort of stressful or annoying. It's intermittent, it's variable, and people definitely lack control over it. And so what we're hoping with this research is that by having this basic data now of, the when, the where, the how often, and the how loud, we can have this more specific and empirically based conversation about what the potential impacts on people and on wildlife would be. So that leads me to section 3, which is thinking about impacts of noise on wildlife. This was a pretty short section, but because I'm just, now that we've done the first part of the research, measuring the extent, just starting to play around with some of these data. Now, this is important to think about because, so the Olympic Peninsula is not just its beautiful landscapes, but it has very rich wildlife communities. And that's one of the things that people treasure. Whenever I go out there, I see elk, I see bear, there's tons of birds. Over 450 bird species are found either temporarily, either migration or they're permanent residents of the Olympic Peninsula. And this is something that people really treasure about this area. So thinking about the impacts of noise on wildlife is very important in this region. Okay, the first big question, how loud are growlers? Hopefully the first portion of my talk, I convinced you that this is a variable noise source and that can make describing how loud they are more complicated. It's more difficult to describe something that comes and goes, right? And then if it's a continuous noise source. However, in our paper, this is how we went about doing this. So here again, we have our spectrogram. In this case, you're looking at 6 hours of data. The growlers are very apparent. They're the tall spikes in the low frequencies. And what we did here is we extracted clips for every single aircraft event. And so the black ones are the growler events. And so we would extract audio clips for each and every growler event. And then we would extract a similar amount, duration for that day and location of what are called ambient sounds. And ambient sound in this case is just everything except aircraft noise. So it would include people talking or vehicles or, wind and rain, all that kind of stuff. And what we did is we used a software program called PAM Guide. And to create, so we did this, for a 10-day period at one location. So we took 10 days of military aircraft data, and we took the same 10 days of the ambient samples, and we compressed them into what's called a power spectral density, which you can contrast. And the power spectral density forms sort of an acoustic profile. So now, instead of frequency being on the x-axis in our spectrogram, instead of being on our y-axis in our spectrogram, frequency is now on the x-axis. And then instead of decibels being color in the spectrogram, decibels are now on the x-axis. And what we end up with is a distribution of loudness by frequency. And so the top panel is for the ambient sound, and the bottom panel then is for all of our growler sounds. So this allows us to say, okay, well, when growlers are flying over, typically, what is the sound signature like? What would wildlife potentially be exposed to or listening to? And what we can see is really obviously is that the ambient sound looks different. The loudest ambient sound that we could see in this example is 60 decibels, whereas the loudest growler sounds are closer to 80 decibels. There's clearly a lot of energy, acoustic energy or decibels below around 1,000 hertz on the lower panel. So now we can analyze this information a little bit better to talk about how loud a growler is, right? The first thing to look at is that when we compare those two profiles, most of the acoustic energy impact is below 1.4 kilohertz for growlers. However, there's a lot of impact below there. So in ambient samples, 90% of our acoustic energy was between 13 and 33 decibels. Again, that sounds like watches ticking and leaves rustling. In jet samples, it's 10 to 20 decibels greater than that. Again, the maximum growlers that we were able to measure were at least 82 decibels. Now that's at least 20 decibels louder than our loudest ambient sounds. Now, the context of this is that for wildlife, ambient sound is very important. The ambient noise conditions are really important, and increases of only 3 decibels, we've doubled that in 3 decibels, but up to 10 decibels, it reduces what's called detection space for many vertebrates by 50 to 90%. And this idea of detection space is so important that I'm going to spend a slide thinking about this. So detection space is the acoustic range at which an animal can detect another call, an alarm call by another bird, the sound of prey, a mating call, the sound of their young. So detection space is the extent, the distance at which animals can detect these things acoustically. So here we're going to use an owl as an example. Owls are acoustic predators, so they make a really good example. And let's say that the owl's unimpaired detection space is about 30 feet. And these are red voles. This is the favorite thing of barred owls. Now, if we increase our ambient noise by 3 decibels, we've reduced that owl's detection space by 50%, fewer voles, right? If we increase it by 10 decibels, we've decreased their detection space by 90%. It's a huge amount. And so we go to the grocery store, it's not that big of a deal for us. We don't care about detection space. However, for animals, these can be very high stakes. It can be a very high stakes issue if you can't detect prey very far, or if you can't detect predators. The next impact of noise that we want to think about is, and it's probably one of the first things that people like to look at when they think about the impacts of noise pollution on wildlife, because animals have to communicate, and they often are doing it acoustically. And so if you add too much noise, you're just drowning out the sound of it. However, because not all sound is impacting all frequencies, you may not be drowning it out. So masking is kind of the first place that we can start to think about which species might be most impacted. Now, again, here's our jet signature of a growler jet over here. And again, most of that acoustic energy is below 1.4 kilohertz. So just as an example, I've used our 2 ESA listed species, northern spotted owl and marbled murrelet, as examples here. And what we can see is that northern spotted owl, clearly low frequency callers, their communication is almost certainly going to be masked by most jet activity. However, marbled murrelet are calling much higher frequencies, so maybe masking is not going to be a problem for marbled murrelet. So I took this concept and just expanded it to the larger bird community. I first used a 2009 study by Drs. Kuehne and Cardoza, and they analyzed calling frequencies. They sort of analyzed and established the dominant calling frequencies for 530 North American birds. And I've showed that on this graph here. I've just basically used their data and plotted out that distribution of what that frequency looks like. And from that, the species that vocalize at or below 1.4 kilohertz, I identified 200 of these species. And then I cross-referenced those species with I cross-reference what I'm calling low frequency calling species with the 263 bird species known to occur in Olympic National Park. There's more birds that occur on the peninsula, but the Olympic National Park documents 263. And what I found is that for about approximately 48% of the species in the park, about 18% would be vulnerable to either full or partial masking from jet noise. And they tended to be seabirds, owls, woodpeckers, ducks, that kind of thing. It was still surprising to me. I didn't quite appreciate how many species are making use of those lower frequencies. So it's a good indication of where you might start to look in terms of which species are maybe going to be most vulnerable to this type of noise pollution. And I think I also offer this example as what we were hoping by establishing, some of the basic data about this source of noise pollution, we can start to ask more focused and targeted empirical questions. Okay, so the final section of this is policy implications and conclusions. So I mentioned that there was an environmental impact statement done that the Navy initiated in 2017, and it's been going on. This study was sort of done around this, in parallel, I guess, this environmental impact statement. The EIS is done under the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA. The Navy initiated it in 2017, and there have been public comment periods, and there have been open houses and trading of information, and then there was a revision to it, and then the final came out in the fall. Now we're actually at the very last stage of this process where the record of decision was expected. It was scheduled to come out in fall of 2020, so really it's expected to be released. It could be any time. So this process is basically complete. The opportunity to comment on it is closed. However, elected officials are paying attention to this issue, and so it's always possible to contact an elected official, your elected official, about this issue, and they certainly know about it. Okay, so because this study was done at a timeline that allowed us to present these data as part of the environmental impact statement, I can actually, the Navy has now responded to some of this work. They've responded in a couple different ways, but I'm going to talk about these two examples because they are very illustrative of some of the key policy and regulatory frameworks that we're dealing with here. So I had a preliminary version of this work that I submitted as public comment. Other people also presented it as their own public comment, or they presented this work with their own public comments last year. And the Navy, of course, responds to substantive comments, right? And the first one is that this was someone else that submitted this work, and the Navy responded back, and they said that the researchers claim that they could distinguish military from non-military flights, but there was nothing in that research to validate the claim. The Navy stands by the statement that it would be difficult to differentiate military aircraft from commercial or general aviation aircraft. Now, I think that in this case, I don't think that that's correct, and I believe that we substantiated that issue, and we discussed the uncertainty, and we substantiated that we were able to establish this pretty well in our paper. But the important thing about this response is that I've been out there, I spent a lot of time out there. It's not, you don't really see the growlers. You hear them for sure, but there's trees, there's clouds. They fly at, high enough elevations that it's very difficult to spot these planes. And you certainly couldn't do it at anything that's called a research scale. Also, you don't know when they're going to fly. So to visually find these things, you just have to sit and wait and hope. So even if somebody gave me $1 million, I still could not sit there and visually confirm if a Growler aircraft is going over as I'm measuring it. Now, of course, the Navy has flight schedule information, and they could validate and verify that. But by saying that the research didn't do it, what they're kind of saying is that you have to take their noise analysis unless they're going to release the data. So what they're bringing up is a logistical and a research, a very problematic research and logistical difficulty. And they're kind of just saying, well, you need to just take our analysis. The second, and for me as a researcher, that presents some big difficulties. Also, then if you're not satisfied with the way that they've evaluated impact, there's no other option. The second response is that the Navy does a noise analysis as part of their environmental impact statement. And so in their final noise analysis, they reviewed this work and they comment on it here. And it says, however, the information contained in this report had limited applicability and does not apply to the FAA recommended methodology for analyzing aircraft noise. Now, I disagree that it had limited applicability. However, they're correct. It is not FAA recommended methodology. But this is actually a very important point. So FAA recommended methodology pretty much says you need to produce an annual average. Now, an annual average is valid. It's a valid approach around commercial airports. And FAA methodology is primarily established in order to measure, evaluate, and mitigate noise around commercial airports. Noise around, so aircraft around commercial airports is continuous, relatively. It's loud, and it's not that variable. So an annual average actually means something in that context. However, the same methodology is being applied in a wilderness and rural area where the noise is intermittent and highly variable. So an annual average just is not it's not informative at all. It doesn't tell you anything, but it is the legal method which is being applied here. So I think that this is a great comment or great response. It's not a great response, but it is a valid response, but it points to this really dramatic gap in the regulatory standard that's being applied. And this is, I think, where advocacy-based organizations come in. When you have this strong gap between policy and regulatory standards that are being used, this is where advocacy-based organizations can come in and advocate for constituents and users, and they can advocate for changes in policy and regulations, right? So the National Park Conservation Association, for example, has taken a strong leadership role in advocating for reductions of the noise impact on the national park. And they're doing some research too. They're set up a Growler tracker. Another advocacy-based organization is Quiet Parks International. And this is my last slide of this talk. And Gordon Hempton is an international acoustic hero, and we're very lucky he's local too. And he and other colleagues of his started the Quiet Parks International, where they advocate internationally for acoustically quiet locations that people can, that they will recommend and for people to go and visit. And part of Gordon's philosophy and also Quiet Parks philosophy is that they're strong proponents of saying you can't just say what you don't want. You can't just say we don't want noise. You have to be a proponent for what you do want. And so if quiet areas are important, you have to find ways to advocate for that. And so this quote of his is, just saying we have the capacity to go out and to be advocates for this. We don't need fancy instruments. We can go out and we can learn about how quiet is for us and why we want to advocate it for it with others. So that's the last bit of this. I have some acknowledgements. I am not exaggerating when I say that this is a hugely collaborative project. It would not have been done without any of these groups or individuals. And so I'm really grateful to be surrounded by so many people that have brought so much passion and energy to this issue.